Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third and final session of Inside the Whitney Biennial 2022. I'm Josh Lubin-Levy. I'm a Joan Tisch teaching fellow here at the Whitney. And if this is your return visit, or if it's your first time joining this class, welcome. If you haven't been here before, just so you know the structure, I will talk for about 45 minutes and I have a slideshow to go along with it. And I'll reserve some time at the end for questions, but you should feel free to ask me questions at any point during my talk. And the best way to do that is to use the Q&A button that's in the Zoom toolbar. For those of you who are interested, captioning is also available. I believe you turn that on through the toolbar. You can also look at the chat for any messages or to message any of the admins who are monitoring the session and helping us make it more accessible. We've been looking at the Whitney Biennial over the last 2 weeks, and we've looked at the themes of abstraction and the role of abstract art, and abstraction as a mechanism for thinking about hard to define but pressing and urgent political topics. We've looked last week at the question of figuration and the return of the body, actual figures in art, but attempts to figure complex systems and social coordinates and relationships. And today, I thought our final theme could be one of retrospection. As I mentioned at the top of this course, this year's biennial has, of course, a number of works by artists who are looking back deep at long, traumatic, resonant, hard to define histories, at the immediate, most recent past few years of our lives, what we had so much time for retrospection, mourning, loss in certain ways. But also the curators as a method have really looked into the past of the Whitney Biennial and thought about what strategies had happened in the past and how to bring some of those forwards. I think one of the most powerful aspects of the biennial is the way in which artists are actually mining history in order to examine ways of moving forward. And there's this beautiful quote by Candace Hopkins in one of the texts that's in the catalog, where she talks about the echo beyond the amplification, and this idea that there needs to be some way to hold on to the urgency of addressing questions, topics, issues, beyond the emergency, the echo beyond the amplification. And so this echoic space is where I've organized some of the topics and the artists that we'll look at today. Just to highlight, what we've been looking at just now is the cover of the 1962 Whitney Annual, which actually is featured in the research materials for the curators for this year's biennial, and has what they talk about in that 1962 annual is this mini retrospective that happened inside of the annual of the artist Joseph Cornell. Joseph Cornell featured a number of his boxes. So it was almost like a retrospective inside of the biennial. At this point in time, Cornell was 59 years old. This is 10 years before he died. Rather unexpectedly. So there's this sense also of an artist looking back at their practice in the present moment, but also thinking about Cornell's influence on contemporary artists. And Joseph Cornell is really well known for these boxes where he collected all this ephemera, detritus, found textual elements, different fragments of film, little images he'd cut out of newspapers, and elevated those details into really sensational ideas, almost monumental thoughts about imagining space and time. Each one of these boxes took elements that you might otherwise overlook and turn them into really resonant symbols. And what I wanted to highlight about the 1962 annual catalog is that one of the works featured in a photograph is this work, Isabelle Dien Bien Phu from 1954. It's part of Cornell's Aviary series. It was in the 62 mini retrospective inside the biennial. And it's a slightly different work for Cornell, because Cornell's boxes are often thought about as these imaginative and associative landscapes, often related to ideas of fantasy and Hollywood. But Dien Bien Phu has this cockatoo bird that seems to have broken the glass on the surface of the box. And there is all this red paint kind of splayed out like blood on the white walls of the box itself. The box was actually meant to be viewed three-dimensionally. And on the back, Cornell had pasted a map of Indochina, thinking about the first Indochina War and the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. So there's this really interesting way, this box in particular, was about Cornell thinking about a space and time outside of his immediate presence, the world of New York City where he lived and worked, but not in the imaginative, fantastical landscape, but really in the landscape of the emerging war and global relations that would lead up to the Vietnam War. So there's really this interesting way in which Cornell was thinking about how do we mediate the world, the globe, in our present space and use the kind of mundane materials of our lives to think about something like an anti-war project. And we could see how that very much registered with artists of the counterculture of the 1960s. So that idea of an artist both being at a certain stage of their career, shifting directions, and being a resource for other artists is something that we'll find recurs throughout the artists that we'll talk about today. In terms of the idea of retrospection, there are a number of mini retrospectives happening in this year's biennial. One of them is to another central artistic figure who has really galvanized the practices of generations of artists and writers, and that's the work of Steve Cannon, a writer and a poet, and the founder of A Gathering of the Tribes, which was first a literary magazine and then a gallery that all took place inside of Steve Cannon's apartment, which was in this building that he bought on 3rd Street between Avenues C and D in Manhattan. He bought the building in 1970. He started Gathering of the Tribes in 1991. And this was 2 years after Cannon mostly went blind from glaucoma. So he often referred to himself as the blind guy, very playfully. But you could think about Cannon as this blind kind of central figure of the East Village performance, poetry, art scene, running this gallery out of his home. And to say that Steve Cannon had an outsized impact on a number of artists, really, I can't overestimate, or it's understated to say that, given the amount of people who have come through this show talking about some kind of personal relationship to Steve Cannon. There was a 2-day readathon of Gathering of the Tribes, and that those 2 days could hardly contain all of the things people wanted to say about Steve Cannon, who passed away in 2019. And this is a photo you see of Cannon here. Behind Cannon is this red wall. And this red wall also appears in the retrospective or the recreation of Cannon's Gathering of the Tribes, or his apartment at the Whitney. And it's a red wall with gold painting on it that was actually done by the artist David Hammons. And it was for one of Hammond's installation projects that happened at Gathering of the Tribes. He was part of a group show there. Hammons did this wall and assembled on top of it salvaged materials of hair, which he would often collect from barbershops, which was one of his modes of working in sculptural materials. And Hammons remains on the board of Gathering of the Tribes. Inside of the exhibition, there are all these personal references to Steve, including his ashtray, which is filled with cigarettes. But there's also writing in the catalog in which Steve talks about the importance of what a tribe was to him, that he wanted to create a space that was really open to anyone. Anyone could come, participate, gather, that it was open across disciplines and across artists, but often the people who gathered at Gathering of the Tribes and used it as an artistic hub were also those who in some ways cared for or attended to Steve, whether it was helping him transcribe his manuscripts or running errands for him, or in the case of curating visual art shows, describing works of art to him. And so there's this beautiful way in which Steve's work is actually about creating forms of access through description and language, but also using that creatively to think about what does it mean to translate a visual work of art into language and then to curate around that descriptive language itself. It's really this kind of intertextual play. Inside of Steve's apartment, there was this kind of plaques that were strung together in a flag that said, "Introduce yourself." And that phrase, "introduce yourself," has that open-ended quality of like, welcome, introduce yourself, kind of enter this space. But also, of course, it has that point of access as well, where introductions, a vocal introduction was quite necessary in Steve's case, insofar as he couldn't necessarily see everyone that was entering into Tribe. So introducing yourself to Steve was a big part of entering and kind of engaging in this environment. And what we have displayed at the Whitney is a number of videos, films that are testaments to Steve, in which he's speaking about his ideas for this artistic space. There's the red wall that's from the David Hammons installation. There's artwork, and there's countless posters that are layered up on the walls that really recreate the history of Gathering of the Tribes, which is this epicenter of a sort of countercultural hub that existed just outside of the edges of like the East Village along Avenue C and D. And so in this way, it's really thinking about these decentered sites of cultural activity. In terms of thinking about retrospections and decentering the sites in which traditional forms of cultural activity, like the museum, the kind of authenticity of the museum and its overarching power structures. One of the exhibitions or displays in the biennial is this mini retrospective of works by the artist Teresa Hak Kyung Cha. Teresa Hak Kyung Cha is a Korean-American artist born in Busan. Her family moved to the United States when Teresa was about 12, 13 years old, and they largely settled in the Bay Area. But Teresa was really a polymath of a figure. Her works are very much about diasporic belonging, questions of kind of living in between cultures and in between languages. She worked in performance, photo, and video at the precipice of these media in the 1970s. She wrote and theorized about media, apparatuses, and cinema as she worked at the Pacific Film Archives. And she was also really a philosopher of language. Teresa had multiple degrees, worked as a publisher, and even could speak 4 different languages. Inside of the 5th floor, which I mentioned before, is all open as a gallery. So there are no partition walls. There are these scrim curtains that divide off a section and have just works by Teresa Hak Kyung Cha. This scrim is actually a reference to one project by Teresa Hak Kyung Cha called Able Whale or A Blue Whale, depending on how you read the title, which is on the right image here. You can see that the A of able and the W of whale have been separated by a space. And there's this poetic chasm between the letter and the word that makes it hard for us to tell if Teresa wants us to read this as able whale or a blue ale or a blue whale. So there's many ways in which the sound of language and the actual spelling and the reading, the visibility of language are pushing against one another here. In this performance, what Cha did was string up this scrim curtain around a space and talk about wanting to exist as the dream of the audience, how the audience imagines her through this opaque transparency. Opaque transparency is itself a contradiction in terms. So inside of this cordoned off space, Teresa performed in white robes, which is a reference to Korean shamanism, where she had these rolls of fabric in red and black that she would unfurl, which is a reference to a shamanistic practice of the shaman actually departing this world, entering the afterworld, and guiding the recently deceased into paradise. So there is this kind of cultural legacy to the work, but it's surrounded by this space that's covered with mirrors and lights that create this almost heightened cinematic space. There's all these ways in which Teresa's image is being reflected and refracted, and we're looking at her through a screen, like the cinema screen, although we're looking through the screen rather than at the screen. There's no way to access the space that Teresa is in. So she really just exists as an image to the viewer for these performances, especially in the photos that document them, which is now displayed to us. But this sense of a division between her kind of lived environment where she's performing and the framed image that we're looking at is that play between liveness and mediation that Cha's works often activated. This is also true in Permutations, a film work of Teresa's from 1976, which is projected right onto the scrim in the Whitney's 5th floor. And it's actually permutations of this cinematic portrait of Teresa's sister, Bernadette. But the viewer might not necessarily know that. In fact, images of Bernadette have often been conflated with images of Teresa. There's a beautiful essay in the catalog by art historian So Young Yoon, who talks about the intercutting of images of Teresa in this film that is otherwise of Bernadette. So this collapsing of the two sisters into one another. And this question of them being permutations or mutations of one another, but also this play against the kind of portrait of the Asian American woman and the ways in which we can and the eye can and cannot decipher, can and cannot catch the divisions between these two individuals becomes a question about identity and belonging and even individuality inside of this film. Teresa often activated language as a space that was filled with the way we try to communicate with one another, but also kind of legacies of nationalism and belonging. She talks in this work from a male art piece called Audience Distance Relative about the time in between when a sound is made and when it returns as an echo. And I just want to highlight that idea, this idea that when you make a sound, it's registered in one way. And when the echo returns, it's registered in the same way. But in between that, the sound waves are traveling further away and then back towards you. And even if you can't perceive them, they still exist. So that sense of like, where does sound exist when it's not being heard? And inside of film pieces like Mouth to Mouth, what we end up seeing is the way Teresa could break down language, much like we saw Renee Green's Banners that broke down the Mae Swenson poem, but break down language in a way that gets us to think about questions of intercultural exchange and diaspora. Mouth to Mouth is a film piece that refers to the mouth-to-mouth practice of resuscitation, but also the transfer of language from mouth to mouth. Mouth, like language as this mimetic form, we learn to use our mouths in a certain way. The camera pans over the title and the letters are so spaced out, you can't read it all at once. You have to wait for the camera to move. Now what the camera will do is pan over graphemes from the Korean alphabet of Korean syllables, language that only some of us would know how to vocalize. Only some of us, much like the English, might know how to speak or what it means. And then what you end up with is a series of images that come through this gray static of a television that show a mouth in the shape of those Korean vowels, making the sounds, but we can't hear them at all. So it's completely physicalized, but it's not auditory in any way. Underneath this is a sound of rushing water. So we come back to this idea of mouth to mouth as a kind of drowning that leads to questions of resuscitation and what is being resuscitated. And the water brings up this sense of movement, migration, diaspora, the transfer of languages across space, but also the drowning out of media, the idea that something in language is drowned out when it becomes codified, when we simply transfer language from mouth to mouth. And it's as much about the cracks in language as it is about the transfer of language from one body to the next, that I think Teresa Hak Kyung Cha activated as a really powerful space of thinking about what exists in the unknowable elements of the languages that we speak. See if I can pass that. In concluding some of the themes around these mini retrospectives that are happening in the Whitney Biennial, I of course have to draw our attention to the work of Ralph Lemon, who is probably not as well known to some of you, especially if your primary focus is visual art. Ralph Lemon is an artist who's better known for his choreography. In fact, Ralph Lemon has been making performances since the 1970s. In 1985, he started a dance company, and at the pinnacle of that dance company's success in 1995, Lemon disbanded his dance company, which is probably what he's most famous for. In part, that disbanding of the dance company was a refusal to have a repertoire in which Ralph Lemon repeated the same works, especially given that that body of work made between 85 and 95 was largely work reflecting on questions of American identity, race, memory, and in some ways to be canonized as a Black artist that makes a certain kind of work was exactly what Lemon was refusing. What Ralph Lemon embarked on starting in 95 was a series of conceptual projects. He called them the Trilogy series. And for those Trilogy series, he began a daily practice of drawing. So what's happening at the Whitney Biennial this year is that Ralph Lemon is displaying a retrospective of 25 years worth of drawing studies, or almost 25 years of drawing studies that will slowly evolve over the duration of the exhibition. So this is what it looked like when the show opened. It was drawings by Ralph Lemon installed on these two support structures, which are the kind of support structures all of the artists on the 5th floor use for their work. Now, the Trilogy series unfolds through a pseudo-ethnographic practice in which Lemon traveled through parts of Africa and Asia and even the American South, studying things like sites of lynchings and racialized violence, and used this question of, how does cultural memory exist and persist in these spaces to create text and drawing, installation projects, as well as performances. After the trilogy series, after the geography series, Lemon went on to make a series of works that largely go under the title, How Can You Stay in the House All Day and Not Go Anywhere, which is a performance that was done in collaboration with Walter Carter, who is ostensibly the oldest man who lived in Yazoo City, Mississippi. Walter was about 100 years old when Ralph Lemon started working with him, and in installations in the gallery space of the kitchen, like the efflorescence of Walter, you could see videos, but also sculptures, but also drawings that were all based on intimate performances that Ralph Lemon and Walter would do in Walter's home. So documentation of performance happening way outside of the spaces of the theater or the gallery. And what we end up with in Lemon's display is this activation of drawings that are related to dances that are inhabiting the museum. One way Lemon describes this is the idea that his work is really about taking whatever modernist frame people want to impose on him, the gallery artist, the theater artist, the black box artist, and working with and against that frame simultaneously. So to have an evolving display is one way to do that, certainly. These are not fixed works like we traditionally have in the gallery, but they'll unfold throughout the duration of the exhibition. And this is actually what the works look like now. And what I think is interesting to highlight in these is that what Ralph Lemon is doing is not only unfolding his body of work, but he's literally unfolded the support structures on which these works are displayed. You can see that the support panels, the white panels, are arranged in a completely different configuration. So they too are becoming these active elements that will move throughout the space. In addition to that, Lemon has intervened inside of different elements that often artists leave untouched, like the wall labels that have their bios and dates and location of birth and the title and media that they're working in. Lemon has inserted this one drawing of a superhero figure where it's a Superman costume where the S has been turned into a big black B. And it says, when I was growing up, I had no writers, no artists, maybe a couple boxers. So there's this way in which the image, it kind of works against the bio of Ralph Lemon, the standardized institutional bio that we have otherwise displayed at the museum. It's also a way of hiding and masking. There's also Ralph Lemon drawings in different floors of the museum if you look through them. So there's this real activation of space in his work. And I think part of that too is to ask questions about where does the artist's work rightfully reside? What does it mean as a performer to have this agency to sort of inhabit the actual space of the museum and to install works in spaces that aren't simply contained to the gallery in which the biennial is ostensibly taking place? And the last artist I'll talk about in terms of these mini retrospectives is the work of Jonathan Berger. Now, this is not a retrospective of Berger's practice, but Berger's project, An Introduction to Nameless Love, is in some ways a way of looking back. And it's a way of looking back at or looking in upon forms of love, true love, that exist outside of the normative, romantic, dyadic couple. An Introduction to Nameless Love is based on a series of individuals or couples who have a kind of relationship that could be defined as true love, but is not the normative relationship one might expect. So for instance, the autistic philosopher and writer Mark Utter is in dialogue with Emily Anderson, who is his communications coordinator and close friend. Or Richard August is a turtle conservationist who talks about his relationship to his work as a form of true love. And the way in which Berger works is a long devotion to these individuals, to meeting with them, talking with them, developing a transcript over years of knowing them, and then turning that transcript over to an editor who edits it down into a condensed version, and then taking that condensed version and turning it into an installation made up of all of these tin letters that have been hand pressed into the form of the transcript and installed in the gallery space. And that practice itself is a collaborative effort that involves many people laying out these templates, arranging all the letters, spelling it all out and setting it. So it really goes from the intimate relationship of true love to this expansive realm of care, starting with Berger and then the editor and then all those who assisted Jonathan Berger in creating this installation that's devoted to these forms of true love that are spoken about in the texts. The letters themselves are beautiful. They're made out of this kind of tin that's quite delicate. It bears all of the markings of everywhere it's been touched or dropped or dinged. And that also gives it this kind of really vibrant, almost shimmering quality to it. One of the things Jonathan Berger talked about was wanting to create an installation that really felt like it wasn't a contemporary gallery space, that almost felt cathedral-like. And he's done that by installing these words that actually glow in our faces, these thin lights, but also this floor of charcoal tiles, which are all individually set, but not affixed to the floor. So it really feels like all of these floating like atoms around this space. And in a way, it's this beautiful tribute to something as simple as love. And I've talked about precedents for this work when I've toured it as someone like Carl Andre making poems or using standardized tiles, but here Carl Andre with this like deep sense of heart and commitment. I also think about how this work is almost like the old history of typesetting a book, laying it down letter by letter, and the intimacy of that act that then leads to its reproduction and dissemination so it can get into the hands of others. So what does it mean to kind of straddle that boundary between the intimacy of these individuals and then the moment when it meets their public is all something that Jonathan Berger activates inside of an introduction to Nameless Love. What all of these artists who are staging these retrospectives have done is really kind of questioned the critical authority of the curators in some way. They've staged their own exhibitions inside of the exhibitions and playfully, I mean, with the invitation, they've intervened in what actually constitute the exhibition that we're coming to visit at the Whitney Biennial. And this idea of dismantling the singular authority of the curator is something we might think about in the framework of a kind of post-colonial logic or even a decolonial aesthetics. How do we think about the structures of cultural authority that we inherit, and how can art respond to that framework? And certainly one artist who's been working with those questions for a very long time is Renee Green. I started talking about Renee Green's work at the beginning of this course with her space poems. The other work Renee Green has in the biennial is this work, Lesson. Lesson is a triptych, it's 3 panels, and it's a painting. Renee Green actually started out as a painter. This work was made in 1989, early part of her career when she was a resident at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and just before she did the Whitney Independent Study Program. Renee Green became probably best known for her installation projects that look at the ways in which archives, especially archives around Black diasporic culture, are collected, displayed, and contained. Import-Export Funk Office was a project in which Renee Green's personal collection of hip hop and the German critic Diedrich Diedrichson's personal collection were put on display as a way of thinking about the circulation of hip hop as a form of Black culture on a global stage, not only as a medium of or a mechanism of kind of cultural appropriation, but of desire. You know, what is hip hop doing or meaning to a German audience when it has such a distinctly kind of American context in which it originates? But that sense of questioning the forms of theft and desire and exchange that exist across culture is something that we find even in Green's early painting works. One of my favorite of her early paintings is Edmund LaForest. It's a project that's about this radical Haitian poet who very symbolically and demonstratively committed suicide in 1915 by tying a Larousse French dictionary around his neck and jumping into the water. And this idea of being weighed down by the dictionary of the French language is certainly a symbol of this Haitian poet being weighed down by the colonizer's language, a sense of being trapped or indentured to this language. And we learn about Edmund LaForest in Renee Green's painting through a plaque, almost like a museum plaque that's installed inside of the painting. Next to that is a reproduced image of a philological diagram, a diagram of how languages have evolved, as if the language is such a scientific mechanism that we can trace its origins back to a singular point. And below that are these illustrations of botany, because Edmund LaForest, in addition to being a poet, was a botanist. And we could certainly think about botany as one space in which the colonial exchange, the movements of plants, is one way in which we can index the global intimacies that have existed across continents. And that's a phrase from Lisa Lowe. And then what I love about this painting is that, of course, there's the reference to LaForest tying the dictionary around his neck in the way that a frame has been tied and hung in front of the painting. And it's hanging from above, but it's a frame that actually can't contain the painting. And it's encouraging us to look outside of the frame, because inside of the frame, all we see is a kind of gestural abstraction. Outside of it, we get the broader context of what La Forest and the botany and the diagrams of language actually bring into our reading of this work. This is also true of Lesson, which is a work that is centralized around a panel that has all these images that come from encyclopedias, that make up taxonomies of creatures, that have their Latin names, but on either side are flanked by quotes, either from Paul Valéry or Jules Verne, in some ways reflecting on the idea for Jules Verne of the museum as the end place where this promised object, this lucky, beautiful object that Verne is writing about should end up. He's actually writing about something he calls a left-handed shell. Or Valéry, the encounter with the beautiful object, the encounter with something gathered here that touches the eye as never before. And we could think about how complicated that is when it's the museum that's determining what it is that the eye sees and then catches as beautiful. And all of this is a way for Green perhaps to think about the idea of taking something like a mechanism like painting, which has its own history of cultural appropriation that's often so buried. Modernist artists often drawing from cultural sources outside of Western culture and never citing their sources. And here trying to bring those sources and citations into the fold, to think about what does it do to look at this medium in that way. This idea of bringing those references into the fold, of complicating cultural authority, is certainly part of the kind of post-colonial criticism literally, and works of art by Trinh T. Minh-ha, who's a scholar and a critic and philosopher as well as a filmmaker. Trinh T. Minh-ha's works might be thought about as a kind of documentary practice, but a work that attempts to resist documentary's tendency to create forms of authority or to define things or to speak on behalf of others. Minh-ha talks a lot about the idea of wanting to create films that speak nearby rather than about, and to do this through the media in a way that separates the image from its sound. So it's never the sense that we're looking at an authentic portrait, but that we're trying to think about how the medium is telling us something that is hard to decipher, hard to know about these spaces that are being recorded. What About China is the work installed in the 2022 biennial, and it's actually from 2021, but the materials that Trinh T. Minh-ha is using are footage that she captured in 1993 and 94. So she's herself looking back at older work, maybe thinking about what that footage from 93, 94 has to say to the present, but certainly also about this idea of what about China, this idea of China as this forgotten element or this definitional subject or object, as like, what does China mean to an audience inside of China, outside of China, on an individual personal level? The breaking up of the ability to ever really know what China stands for is precisely what Minh-ha's works are going to push us towards. And as you can see in these films, it's a real attention to architecture, to bodies moving through space, to the rural landscape. One of the key themes in What About China is the idea of harmony, which is a really ancient virtue in Chinese culture. You could think about yin and yang and the balance, but it's also a virtue that's been mobilized in very different ways at different cultural moments in China's history, whether it was about the Cultural Revolution and thinking about balancing the kinds of needs of production and dissemination throughout like a kind of social community, or today, conversations about what's called the Great Uprooting and these attempts to industrialize or modernize rural parts of China as a way of quote unquote harmonizing with the present. So harmony becomes this really complicated term that's loaded with ideology, but in some ways is a principle about trying to find balance between these elements. Much like when you watch the film, you're looking for elements of balance between images and auditory elements, between sound, the kind of music that exists underneath the stories that are being told about China itself. And these works of Renee Green and Trinh T. Minh-ha and even Teresa Hak Kyung Cha are all in different ways manifested in younger artists like Namira, who's a Korean-American artist whose work in the biennial is called Night Vision, Read as Never Been. Night Vision is based on a series of works that Namira has made using this camera shooting in night vision that starting in 2018 after a visit to Korea would reproduce these glitches in the film. So it's about embracing the glitch in the media, but it's also a work, a practice that's looking at questions of media as a form of cultural memory and cultural preservation, both at a big kind of political level and a personal level. Namira's great grandmother was a Korean shaman. Korean shamanism is often performed by women. And she was a Korean shaman during a period of Japanese occupation when Korean shamanism was largely being outlawed. So it was really an illicit practice. And as part of their trip to Korea, one of the things that Namira did was to reperform elements from her grandmother's practice. And then you find, or the artist found that in these films, there were these glitches, which in some ways become like evidence of the ghosts, the ancestors that are always haunting this media. It's not only Namira's great grandmother that is referenced in these films, but other kind of precedents of artists looking at the cracks between cultural legacies or the ways we communicate. In the upper right corner here, what you're looking at is a still from Teresa Hak Kyung Cha's unfinished film about Korea, White Dust White Dust from Mongolia, which is being projected in Namira's studio. And in this segment, Namira will actually perform in front of that projection. So it's this question of how their works actually build upon their legacies to one another. In the red down below, it's Namira performing a kind of ritualized action in the streets of New York City, right outside of the Puck building, which is where Teresa Hak Kyung Cha was actually very brutally murdered in 1982, which is the year that Namira was born. So there's this way in which there's a folding together of the artist's legacies as a way of thinking about how they might carry on this kind of ineffable quality of searching for what exists in between the fissures of cultural, personal, and even ancestral belongings. And then on a different register, although not entirely separate, is one of my favorite projects in the biennial, which is the Juarez archive by Alejandro Morales, which is a work you should absolutely engage with if you get a chance to come to the museum. But quite quickly, Morales is from Juarez and was unable to travel back to Juarez during the pandemic. And so created this archive of images searching Google image search of Juarez, and then placing those individual slides in these slide viewers, these individual viewfinders, which you can actually interact with at the Whitney Museum. So they're all hanging from a chain and you can look at them, and they even have a takeaway piece quality to them. Some of them you can actually get in the Whitney's gift shop, and some of them were being given away for free. What I love about this project is that it activates something that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, Google Maps and its street view function. But we don't often think about the street view function as having a kind of personal archive to it, nor do we often think about how these photos are from a certain time and place that is not the present moment. And that's very much active in these images because the photos taken of Juarez are largely from Google's car driving around between 2008 and 2013. It's a period in which Juarez was largely being described in the media as a hub of the drug trade. So there's a particular portrait of Juarez that's captured in these images. And by atomizing it, and breaking it down and forcing the viewer to look at the images one at a time, Morales is introducing some kind of critique to the monumental idea of what Juarez is, but also introducing this personal idea of fantasy and looking through a viewfinder or stereoscope or any sort of visioning device to see these kind of otherworldly spaces. So the desire and the fantasy of the space is then pushed against the idea that these are scientific mappings that Google is producing for us. And that idea of pushing between fantasy and desire and science is at the heart of what Lucy Raven does, although her subject is really the American Southwest. This is a film that's one of three in a series of triptychs, a series of Westerns that Raven is producing. This work, Demolition of a Wall, album 1, this clip, is what's on view at the Whitney's Biennial. It's filmed in New Mexico at a blast site. And what Raven does is film blasts going off, the testing of bombs, whether for the US military or private contractors. And we don't see the blast, but we hear it. And then we see an image of the American Southwest landscape And slowly we'll see the shockwave ripple through the image, totally disrupting the natural portrait of the landscape, reminding us that we're looking through a camera, reminding us that we're looking at a screen and seeing this thing that the eye wouldn't be able to capture, but that the camera can. And it's the way in which media and technology have conditioned our fantasy of the American Southwest. You can think of American Hollywood films of the West, which are all shot on a soundstage, which somehow produce this myth of the open, rough terrain, versus the ways in which this is the terrain in which bombs, the atomic bomb has been tested, in which military and technology are heavily invested, in which colonialism is part of its deep legacy, is all kind of the balance between the reality of the Southwest and its fantasy life. And that Raven puts these into contrast by creating a film that doesn't have a narrative, that isn't structured like a Hollywood film, that doesn't play on the tropes of the Western, but uses the Western as a background and uses media to deconstruct it and to dissect it, and to show the ripples in the image that we're looking at here. Excuse me. And this idea of showing us the ways in which technology and the landscape interact with one another has a great resonance with the work by Danielle Dean, which is very closely installed to Lucy Raven's work on the fifth floor. Danielle Dean's project is this expansive study of the Amazon, both the Amazon Corporation, but also the Amazon as a hub in which Henry Ford established Fordlandia in the early 20th century. It was meant to be a direct pipeline of rubber going to the Ford Motor Company in Detroit. And it was a huge failure of a work camp. It was a huge ecological failure when he planted all these rubber trees together and they became infested with bugs. So this sense of industry and the environment is at the heart of Dean's research subject, but it's also about Ford as a car company, producing a kind of fantasy of autonomy and command of the landscape. What we see in Danielle Dean's work is this really in-depth research study of the Ford Motor Company, the way it's been advertised, of Fordlandia. And as I mentioned, she pairs this with an investigation of the Amazon Corporation today, at-home work, human intelligence workers and Amazon Turk workers, who work from home, and thinking about this kind of landscape of labor and these fantasies of autonomy and individuality. But the central piece in the Whitney Biennial is this film, Long Low Line, Fordland, which is an animation based on the landscapes that you can find in Ford advertisements throughout history. But it uses an animation technique that was largely popularized by the Disney Corporation, which has these very distinct foreground, middle ground, background. And it's the kind of like roving or scrolling landscape that you might project behind a car on a soundstage to make it look like the car was driving. So it has this way of producing the fantasy of motion and movement. And through these landscapes, we transition from the scenes that the Ford Motor Company advertised with renderings by Danielle Dean of the actual kind of destruction and dystopia they produced. And the whole film actually ends in a three-dimensional space, entering in actual images of the Amazon rainforest itself. So it really is a work that kind of gets us to look at the way in which the car isn't only about its environmental impact, but the way it's ideologically constructed through years of advertising and production. And one of those elements of production here is the commercial, but it's also the scrolling line of the film here, which maps onto the scrolling line of the assembly line, which is what Ford's Motor Company was famous for. And what Henry Ford said about that assembly line, which moved in this direction, is that workers don't go to their work. Work comes to the workers and it makes them more efficient. And that phrase, work comes to the workers, is maybe one point of connection I can leave you with in terms of how this project then folds into Amazon Turk workers, work from home, and the landscape of kind of online labor that exists today. Moving forward from Dean, I wanted to talk just quickly about a few artists who introduce questions of retrospection as a form of carrying tradition forward and carrying history forward, but also as acts of care. This is kind of profound element of the work of Raven Chacon, who has several projects in the Whitney Biennial. One of them I've talked about before, which is Silent Choir at Standing Rock, which is a project in which Chacon has separated a field recording of a silent protest that happened at the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. That audio is in the antechamber at the Whitney's Museum 6th floor gallery. And then outside the Whitney is this billboard of the image from that field recording. So the image and the sound are displaced from one another. You can only access one, but it really immerses you in the kind of animate space of this silent, we could say, ongoing protest. But in terms of carrying things forward, what Chacon has produced as well is a project called For Zit Kala Sa, which is 13 individual scores dedicated to individual indigenous women, artists, and musicians as a way of creating scores in their likeness and the style that these artists work in, as a way of honoring their practice, but also as talking about these 13 contemporary artists as working as an ensemble or in the wake of Zit Kala Sa, who was an indigenous woman, an activist, an educator, and a musician from the turn of the 20th century. So there's this kind of legacy of these women artist activists that's coursing through this work. And what you end up with are these scores that are all done in different notational or symbologic style. Laura Ortman's score, for instance, here uses familiar music notes. So this might be something that a reader might be able to actually read. And all of this is based on the kind of practice that Laura Ortman has as an artist, the kind of notations she might use. It's work that in some ways is done from Raven Chacon, who's an artist and a composer and has worked with Laura Ortman, knowing her very well. But it's also a way of giving back to Ortman's practice, reflecting Chacon's own perspective on Ortman's work. Other scores have a much more complex symbology to them. Suzanne Kite is an artist who works between performance and artificial intelligence and technology. And a lot of her work uses math and complex formulas and algorithms. So here we have this numerological score that, as Raven Chacon says, really does end up becoming something of a portrait of Suzanne Kite. It has this ambiguity. The viewer would, a musician interpreting this score would have to really interpret how to read these numbers. So there's this sense of the musician entering their own perspective into the work. But as Chacon also says, the scores are not arbitrary. There is a kind of intentional construction there. So there is a proper way, according to the artists, to read these scores. So in a way, it's like Raven Chacon is inviting us to misread them and thinking about what does it mean to see something that we don't necessarily have the specificity to understand, but to know it's a score and that we're being called to imagine its activation, its performance. And how this actually is very much part of the kind of struggle of contemporary Indigenous art, where on the one hand, many of these artists are working with Indigenous cosmologies that won't be familiar to audiences and working with a specificity that isn't the right of all of us to appropriate and to use, but in some ways in sharing those cosmologies, that knowledge, those practices outward, ends up making that work available in a different way. So there's this complex element to the score. Many of the scores even look like they're actually kind of echograms or recordings of individuals. A lot of the scores use different tribal geometries. So it's really borrowing widely from the idea of the score. And it's not only sticking in Indigenous practices, but it's also using score techniques from minimalist musicians and experimental musicians and other artists to think about the many ways in which artists have tried to encode their practice so that they can give it over to others. And what does it mean to hand your practice or your performance over to others to carry it forward? Becomes the complexity of these existing not only as beautiful kind of abstract portraits of these artists that they're dedicated to, but as scores that are meant to be performed and reimagined. That idea of reimagining, performing, and carrying on is something that I find to be profoundly at the heart of this work by Julie Tolentino, which is a collaboration with the artist Ivy Kwan Arce. For the biennial, Julie Tolentino and Ivy Kwan Arce worked together to create this installation, largely out of a shared relationship to being AIDS activists in New York. Ivy has a practice as a graphic designer. Julie is a movement-based artist and a dancer and performer, and also designed the club, the Click Club. Ivy is an HIV positive and is a mother and lives nearby the Whitney and has largely fallen out of the framework of the arts in some way. And it was at a 2008 symposium at the Whitney when Ivy reintroduced herself to Julie and asked her, how do I become someone who's known for the work I did for ACT UP and for AIDS activism and continues to do? And so that's where this project actually generated. The work of Julie Tolentino is the ground, I would say, of this practice. And it's a practice of deep collaboration as a form of care. One of Tolentino's better known large-scale projects is The Sky Remains the Same, which is a practice in which Tolentino has worked to archive individual artists' performance practices or projects, actual specific projects, into and onto her body. These are all artists that Julie knows, that she's worked with before. And the practice of archiving their work into her body is not simply one of reperforming these actions, but it's a deep, engaged study of, for instance, in this case, the archiving of Lovett Coronione's Weighted, studying their performance weighted, thinking about what is underneath the kind of surface appearance of this work. How can one body become a vessel that carries forward the history of another? And to think about Ivy and Julie as AIDS activists, this legacy of carrying on the work of others, of being the archive for another person, of being a kind of strategy of care that also involves some form of self-sacrifice and decentering of the self, is all part of a legacy of activism that has folded into Tolentino's art practice. This is particularly apparent in this glass installation that Tolentino created and in some ways handed over to Ivy. So what you see here are two sets of glass objects. Lower lying orbs are these GPS devices. There's a twin orb that Ivy has given out to members of an intricate network that makes up how she's understood her own survival and life with HIV for the past 3 decades. And as those individuals who are holding these orbs outside of the museum move around, a signal is sent to the orbs that are in the gallery here, and that transforms the lights that you see that are projected on top of them. So there's this movement of light that becomes an activation of an invisible network of care that exists around Ivy as an individual, and activates our thinking about who are the kind of extended networks of care that we rely on to hold us together even when they're not in our presence. And then behind that, on the higher plinths or pedestals, are these glass bricks. And these glass bricks are all made by Julie Tolentino. Some of them have been properly tempered and some of them are improperly tempered, which means that they're quite fragile and they're subject to breaking and fissures. And each time that these bricks break in different ways or a crack appears, you could think about the kind of break in the network or the relationships between them. But there's also this sense of them kind of cracking open and the desire not to fix the cracks, but to allow them to exist in this space as the kind of fractured histories that Julie and Ivy are trying to attend to and make space for in the galleries here. So with that, I will, with Julie's work and Ivy's work, I'll end and turn to the Q&A to make sure that we have some time to answer any questions. Jean says, I was captivated by the Teresa Hak Kyung Cha exhibit. Permutations made me think a lot about race, with Black and white screens alternating between the portrait of an Asian American woman. What are your thoughts about the issue of race in her work? I think certainly the question or the topic of race and an interrogation of race is quite prominent in Teresa Hak Kyung Cha's work. And it's, I would say it's, your reading of permutations, especially if you see this film, which is really like this flashing portrait of Teresa's sister. It's meant to confuse you in some ways about who is this figure we're looking at? Does the permutation refer to the shift in her body as she turns towards and away from the camera? Is it supposed to be the permutations in the camera itself, which frames the body in different ways? Or are there different figures that are appearing in different ways? So that idea of like what makes up race as a unifying signifier, but also as the different ways in which Teresa and Bernadette maybe inhabit race is something that comes through in that medium. But I also think it's about like race as a signifier, meaning race as a kind of language. And that's where Teresa's work is often activated, at the idea about how language functions. So that in something like Abel Whale, or even in other pieces that I don't have good photos of, where Teresa Aveugle Voix is a performance about blind words and blind seeing. This idea of a complication of the senses is one way in which I think Hak Kyung Cha's works aren't representational in the way that they take up a question of race, but they think about race as always fractured, as always multiple, and they try to kind of illustrate that multiplicity in the way that they make their works. What media does Ralph Lemon use, and are the drawings rearranged during the museum hours? That's a great question. Ralph Lemon uses all sorts of mediums. I don't believe he is constrained to one. The works that we're seeing here are largely acrylic on canvas. That's what he's been working in here. He's done some pen and ink drawings, but Lemon's work is very much anti-medium specific. It's sort of like whatever medium he chooses is him trying to find the best conduit for the ideas that he's exploring in the work. And then the question, did Jonathan Berger know the people in the different stories before he began this art piece? It's a combination, I believe. Jonathan has talked about the precedent for this interest in exploring nameless love as his own relationship to the artist Ellen Cantor, and the fact that they were introduced and became very close friends and had this almost true love relationship before Ellen passed away from cancer. And so it's hard to say, was Jonathan deeply involved in their lives? I think to different degrees with different participants in the work, but they all the participants in the work participated in its construction and editing. So the act of getting to become involved in their love, I think, is the really key part of that work, rather than like how much were these people that were part of Jonathan's own history. Without the valuable information that I've shared, without the valuable information that you have shared in regard to the artwork being presented in the biennial, how can we expect viewers to leave with a fair appreciation? What advice would you have for us for future exhibitions? That's a great question. I think that the truth is there is a way in which talking about the works maybe makes them seem more complicated than they are, because I bring a lot more information than you would get just seeing them. We're not just talking about the visual descriptions of these works. But my advice, and this is always my advice every time I walk through the galleries with anyone, and it's what I do myself, is that just spending time with a work and trusting that it has some logic to it, and that you're allowed to have your opinions of it, that there is no authority on the work, that your experience of it is part of what the work is. That's what I would say is like the fair way to go through an exhibition. I think oftentimes we feel really alienated in the gallery, like there's some information being hidden from us that we don't know, where we're not being told the thing we need to know in order to understand the work of art. I don't think you need to know anything specific about Ralph Lemon to appreciate the drawings that he's made, for instance, since we're looking at them. As you look at them, what you'll see is that like there are all these different pieces. There's this multiplicity, there's portraiture, there's a cartoonish quality, there's representations of Black bodies. All of that can lead you to think things about the kind of work that Ralph Lemon is creating, which certainly wouldn't introduce you to his choreographic practice that you might look up afterwards. But to have a fair assessment of what the works are doing is really just to be in front of them and to spend some time asking what you see in front of you in that particular moment. Films like What is China, 135 minutes, where is it set up in the installation in a separate room, able to view, can you sit in it? Yes, these are all good questions. So films like What About China by Trinh T Minh-ha are on the 6th floor, which is largely more of a black box space. And they're in their own individual screening rooms with seating so that people can watch the duration of the film. The work has been installed like this in other places as well. And there are screenings that Trinh T Minh-ha will do of these works. And that's often just up to the artist based on whether they want their films shown in only gallery settings or they're willing to do screenings as well. But in terms of accessibility and comfort, the Whitney certainly made every effort they can with the longer film pieces to provide space for viewers and visitors to actually sit and watch the films, and they're running on loop. So they're constantly available to us. And I do think, given the nature of the film, What About China, to enter the film at any point is okay, because it isn't a narrative that's trying to tell you about China. And it's actually against that authoritative structure of narrative that Trinh T. Minh-ha's works work. It's almost against that logic that she's trying to give you an experience of this being alongside the question of what is China, or how is China figured in the media and across time. So there's something about allowing the works to not be so precious as objects that is very much part of her practice. Thank you for ending with the works that touch on the land. How about the materiality of the land? The current biennial, for instance, has blocks of soil and an elephant. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There are artists who are working, I don't have any good slides of their work, but artists working with the materiality of earth, dirt, land. We looked at Ellen Gallagher's paintings. Some of her pages are dyed with mud. Ryndon Johnson's work, who we looked at last week, incorporates natural elements like coffee, seed, earths, and dirt. And I believe some of that also is in Dwayne Linklater's paintings / sculptures, the Winter Count series. I also, there was something else I was thinking about, but there isn't, an artist. Oh, and an artist who I haven't talked about, Veronica Ryan, works really beautifully with these elements of seeds and fragments of things that could actually be real seeds that are bundled together, and some that are sculptural elements, to think about that exchange of botany that I was talking about with Edmund LaForest's work, but also collecting and bundling together things like plastic bottles from the ocean. So to think about the contaminations of the earth and the soil. And what's really jarring, I think, about Ryan's installation is that these elements are displayed in bundles as if they've been gathered up from the earth. And it's not really easy to tell whether they're being gathered up as waste or gathered up as precious objects. So there's something about the contamination of the soil and the way in which materials are extracted from it that's very much part of Ryan's installation as well. Why was the Teresa Hak Kyung Cha surrounded by an opaque curtain? It used to be just a scrim so that you could look through it. Yes, there has been a few days recently where in the galleries, the Teresa Hak Kyung Cha work has been surrounded by an opaque curtain. And I believe right here, I believe it's translucent, but it's for conservation purposes. A lot of the work from Teresa's archive is very fragile, and the direct sunlight can be damaging to it. So there are moments where it has to be protected. And so they have a second curtain that goes around it and that actually protects it. We are almost at time. Just trying to see if there's any other quick questions. There's one question about Nayland Blake's installation, so I'll end with that. Nayland Blake does have a project that I didn't get to mention, which is on the first floor, the lobby gallery, which is a recreation of the entrance to the mine shaft, which was a men's only, gay men's members only sex club that existed in the meatpacking district from the 70s until about 1984 when it was shut down by the New York City Health Department. The mine shaft entrance has these signs that say private members club, and it's all installed right at the back door to the Whitney, which is a door that is never used, but when you walk by the West Side Highway, is that private members only gesturing to the space of the museum as a kind of exclusionary space where only some artists are, of course, being installed at any given moment. Certainly the biennial brings up these questions about the context of cultural exclusion, but also as gesturing to the history that's no longer present in the meatpacking district, the history of queer nightlife. And Julie Tolentino's work folds beautifully into that, because the mine shaft, which Blake has recreated the entrance of. And I should say Nail and Blake is also going to be doing performances. So their practice is much more extensive than just the installation on the ground floor. But the mine shaft that Blake has recreated the installation of had this deeply kind of masculine focus. And so projects like the Click Club, which was a queer women of color party that Julie Tolentino and Jaguar Mary ran starting in the 90s, was in some ways a way of kind of responding to that history, taking it up, but also expanding it as well. And that idea of taking up history and finding ways to move forward with it, and to expand it, to deconstruct it and to critique it and to open out towards a different future is some of the most resonant work for me in the biennial. And I think that's where, unfortunately, I have to leave you. If you do get a chance to come by the museum, I certainly hope you get a chance to explore many of these works and the works that I didn't get a chance to talk about. And thank you for joining us for Inside the Whitney Biennial 2022. Have a great rest of your afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are.